Sewol ferry disaster. On April 16, 2014, students from Danwon High School in South Korea boarded the Sewol ferry for a class trip to Jeju Island. There were 476 people on board. Most were teenagers. They wore their school uniforms and carried backpacks. Some had cameras. Others had snacks for the journey. They were excited. It was supposed to be a fun field trip. The ferry was 475 feet long. It had been modified to carry more passengers and cargo. The modifications made it less stable. But nobody told the students this. Around 8:48 a.m., the ferry was sailing through the Yellow Sea. The water was calm. Students were in the common areas. Some were eating breakfast. Others were taking selfies and posting on social media. A few were still sleeping in their cabins below deck. At 8:49 a.m., the ferry made a sharp turn, too sharp that it caused the ship to tilt to one side. Students stumbled and trays slid across the floor. Everyone was in panic. Then, the intercom crackled. A voice told everyone to stay where they were. The students obediently listened. They trusted the crew, but the ship never stopped tilting further. On the other end, the captain and crew members began evacuating. They left first, leaving the passengers aboard. At 9:30 a.m., the ship was already listing at 50 degrees. Students in lower cabins were faced with rising water. The corridors had become steep slopes. Some tried climbing out. Others stayed in their rooms like they'd been told. They were scared, confused. Yet, the water kept rising. Students who tried escaping faced flooded stairwells. The water was dark and cold. Some made it to windows but couldn't break through. Others got stuck in narrow passages as the ship turned on its side. At 10:31 a.m., the Sewol capsized completely. Divers arrived but couldn't get inside immediately. The currents were too strong. When they finally entered, they found students still in their cabins, still wearing their uniforms. Some were holding hands. Others had their life jackets on, but had never left their rooms. 304 people had died, most of whom were students from Danwon High School. Only 172 survived. Shoes and backpacks later washed up on shore. The captain was later arrested and sentenced to life in prison. Mount Hood Incident. On May 12, 1986, 19 students and staff from Oregon Episcopal School gathered at Timberline Lodge on Mount Hood. They were there for base camp, a required outdoor education program. The students were excited. Most had never climbed a mountain before. The group included experienced climbers and teachers. The weather forecast looked good. They planned to climb to the summit and back in one day. The morning was clear and cold. Students wore field jackets and carried backpacks. Some joked and laughed as they hiked. Others were quiet, focusing on the climb ahead. By afternoon, they'd reached higher elevations. The weather was still clear. Everything felt perfect. Then suddenly the conditions changed. Clouds rolled in fast. Wind speeds increased. Visibility dropped. What had been a clear mountain became a white wall of blowing snow. The group tried to descend, but the whiteout made navigation nearly impossible. They couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The wind was so loud they had to shout to hear each other. The temperature was dropping. Students huddled together trying to stay warm. Some were already showing signs of hypothermia, shivering, confused, moving slowly. The leaders tried to radio for help, but the storm interfered with transmission. Their calls didn't get through. Night fell. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind speeds hit 100 miles per hour. Students dug into the snow trying to create shelter. The storm lasted through the night. Students in light jackets faced brutal cold. Frostbite set in. Hypothermia took hold. Rescuers tried reaching them, but the storm was too severe. Helicopters couldn't fly. Ground teams couldn't move in the whiteout. By morning, the storm had passed. Rescue teams found the survivors first. Then they found the others. Bodies curled near rocks. Clothing became stiff with ice. Some students had been only yards from safety, but couldn't see through the storm. 9 people died. 7 students and 2 adults. They froze to death on a school trip that was supposed to teach them outdoor skills. Nyanga Bus Tragedy. On August 3, 1991, students from St. Kilian's Mission School piled onto buses for a sports day trip at Regina Coeli School in Zimbabwe. It was a beautiful morning. The kids were loud and excited. They'd spent the day competing in games, running races, playing football, and laughing with friends. Around 82 school children were on the buses heading home. They were tired but happy. Some had won medals. Others compared bruises from the day's activities. The bus was full of chatter and singing. The route moved through the mountains near Nyanga, 180 miles southeast of Zimbabwe's capital, Harare. Beautiful scenery, sharp curves, steep drops. The bus was moving fast, too fast for the winding roads. Some students noticed. A few felt nervous as the bus swayed around corners. Teachers told the driver to slow down. He didn't listen. The bus approached another curve. At that moment, the driver hit the brakes, but it was too late. The bus rolled off the road down the hillside. Students screamed. Bodies tumbled inside. Windows shattered. When it finally stopped, The wreckage was catastrophic. The bus had been torn apart. Bodies were scattered across the slope. Sports equipment lay everywhere. Survivors crawled out. Some were in shock. Others screamed for help. The smell of petrol filled the air. A few students tried helping their friends but couldn't move them. Too much blood, too many injuries. Rescue took hours. The crash site was a remote rural valley. There were limited emergency services. The accident claimed the lives of 89 people. 82 were school children. Kids who'd been celebrating just hours earlier are now gone because a driver wouldn't slow down. Alton Bus Incident. On September 21, 1989, students in Alton, Texas boarded their school bus in the morning. It was a regular day, junior and senior high school students heading to class. 81 students were on board. The bus traveled along Highway 336. The driver was familiar with the route. A few moments later, something tragic happened. At an intersection, a Dr. Pepper delivery truck approached from another direction. The truck driver was supposed to stop, but he didn't stop. Suddenly, the truck slammed into the side of the bus at full speed. The impact was massive. Metal crunched. Glass exploded. Students were thrown from their seats. The bus veered off the road. It plunged into a water-filled caliche pit and began sinking immediately. Students were disoriented from the crash. They tried finding exits, but they couldn't find any because bodies were pressed together, blocking the exits. Within minutes, the water was already over their heads. The students held their breath. They tried swimming toward the windows, but many couldn't break through. Others got trapped by seat frames and metal debris. Some students near the exits made it out. They surfaced gasping and watched in horror as the bus sank deeper. Rescuers arrived and dove into the murky water. They pulled students out one by one. Some were conscious. Most weren't. 21 students were recorded dead from the incident. Dead Sea Tragedy. On October 25, 2018, school children from Jordan arrived at Zarqa Mayan near the Dead Sea for an educational trip. It was a popular spot. Hot springs, beautiful gorges, and rocky passages perfect for photos. The morning was sunny and warm. Students explored the area. They took pictures and walked through narrow wadis. These were dry riverbeds carved through rock. But the students didn't know that wadis can become death traps in minutes. Around midday, students were posing for group photos in a narrow gorge. Teachers supervised. Everyone was relaxed, happy. Then someone heard a noise, a sound like distant thunder. Within minutes, it grew louder. Then a wall of brown water came roaring through the gorge. It was a flash flood moving at incredible speed. It was 6 feet high, carrying debris, rocks, branches, everything in its path. Students screamed and tried running, but there was nowhere to go. The gorge walls were too steep. The water was too fast. It hit them like a truck. They were swept off their feet. Teachers grabbed at children, but the current was too strong. Bodies tumbled in the churning water. Some clung to rocks. Others were carried downstream. The water kept coming, wave after wave, brown and violent. Students who'd grabbed onto something watched their friends disappear in the current. Some students managed to climb higher on the rocks. Others weren't fast enough. The flood swept them into wider channels, bashed them against boulders, pulled them under. Rescue teams arrived, but the flood was still raging. They couldn't reach everyone. They watched helplessly as students were carried away. Parents arrived at the scene. The sounds of mothers crying mixed with rushing water. When the flood finally subsided, rescuers found bodies scattered along the wadi. Some were miles from where they started. Others were buried in mud and debris. 21 people died. Most were school children, killed by water that came from storms they never saw. A sunny day turned into a nightmare in seconds. Parktown Boys Tragedy. On January 15, 2020, grade 8 students from Parktown Boys High School in South Africa arrived at Nyanga Bush and Riverbreak Lodge for orientation camp. It was supposed to build teamwork and help new students bond. The camp was near the Crocodile River. One of the activities required students to build rafts and cross the river. The students were excited. It felt adventurous, like something from a movie, until it became something else. 13-year-old Enoch Mpianzi was among them. He helped build a raft with his group. They tied logs together and tested the ropes. Teachers and camp staff supervised them. The river looked calm. Brown water moved slowly. Students didn't know the current was stronger than it appeared. The groups pushed their rafts into the water. Some rafts were more stable than others. Enoch's raft looked wobbly, but they launched anyway. The raft made it a few meters from shore. Then it started tipping. Students tried balancing, but the raft flipped. At that moment, they fell into the brown water. Most of them surfaced quickly, grabbed onto logs, and started swimming. Teachers on the bank shouted instructions, but Enoch didn't surface. Students looked around for him, called his name. Nothing. The water was too dark to see below the surface. They started searching. Students on the bank watched in growing panic. Where was Enoch? Rescue efforts began, but they were slow. The camp didn't have proper emergency procedures. No lifeguards, no immediate rescue equipment. Minutes passed, then an hour. Other students were pulled from the water, but not Enoch. His classmates stood on the bank wrapped in towels, shivering, crying. They'd just watched their friend disappear. The next day, his body was found. Downstream, he'd drowned. He wasn't wearing a life jacket. Kerala Bus Incident. On October 5, 2022, students from Kerala, India boarded a private tourist bus for a school outing. It was late evening. Most students were tired from the day's activities. Some slept in their seats. Others talked quietly. The bus traveled along a highway heading home. The driver was going fast, much faster than safe. He was trying to overtake another vehicle. Ahead was a state transport bus, but the driver didn't see it until it was too late. He slammed on the brakes. The bus skidded, but the speed was too high. The tourist bus crashed into the state bus at high speed. The impact was catastrophic. The front of the bus crumpled. Students were thrown forward and the bus rolled onto its side. Inside was chaos. Students who'd been sleeping woke up to pain and screaming. Others couldn't move. They were trapped by twisted metal and overturned seats. Those who could move tried helping others, but some students weren't responding. Blood covered the floor. The smell of fuel filled the air. Emergency services arrived. They cut through metal to reach trapped students, pulled bodies from the wreckage. Some students were conscious. Others weren't breathing. Parents rushed to hospitals. Corridors filled with crying families. Doctors worked on student after student. Some survived with injuries. Others didn't make it. Eventually, 9 people died, 5 of whom were students. Uasin Gishu Incident. On October 28, 2023, primary school pupils from Arap Moi Primary School in Kenya arrived at a man-made dam in Uasin Gishu County for a school outing. It was supposed to be an educational trip in preparation for an examination. The children were young and excited. The dam was a popular local spot, perfect for small boat rides and nature lessons. The teachers had organized canoe trips across the water. The children gathered at the water's edge. They wore their school uniforms. Some carried lunches their parents had packed. They talked excitedly about getting in the boats. Most had never been in a canoe before. The boats were small and made with simple wooden craft and rafts. They climbed in groups, too many in each boat. The teachers tried organizing them, but the children were eager. They pushed off from shore. The boats sat low in the water, overloaded, but they didn't notice. They were laughing, splashing water at each other. As they moved slowly across the dam, one of the boats started tipping. The children shifted their weight trying to balance, but there were too many bodies on one side. The boat tilted further, and water started pouring over the edge. The children screamed. Some tried jumping to the other side, but that made it worse. At 5 p.m., the boat flipped completely. They all fell into the water. Most couldn't swim. They tried grabbing onto the overturned boat, but their hands kept slipping. Nobody was wearing life jackets. Teachers on shore started shouting. Other boats tried turning back, but they were too far away. The pupils in the water were sinking fast, small arms reaching up, faces disappearing under the surface. The water wasn't deep, but panic made them forget to stand. They inhaled water, choked and drowned. Teachers ran into the water trying to reach them, but by the time they got there, several children had already sunk. The surface was eerily calm, just ripples where they had been moments before. Rescuers pulled the children from the water. Some were still conscious, coughing up water. Others were limp. The pupils were wrapped in blankets and sat crying, watching their friends being carried away. In the end, 5 pupils died. They had drowned in a school outing that should have been fun. Lake Timiskaming Incident. On June 11, 1978, 27 students from St. John's School in Toronto set out on a canoeing expedition. The boys were between 12 and 13 years old. It was part of the school's mandatory outdoor education program, a character-building wilderness trip on Lake Timiskaming, about 217 miles north of Ottawa. 4 teachers and staff went with them for supervision. They'd done this trip before. It was tradition. The boys paddled in groups. Multiple canoes spread across the lake. The water was calm at first. The boys were in good spirits. Some sang songs. Others competed to see who could paddle fastest. They were miles from shore when the weather suddenly changed. Dark clouds appeared on the horizon. The calm water turned choppy. Teachers recognized the danger. They signaled the canoes to head for shore, but they were too far out. Before they could reach land, the storm hit. The boys paddled desperately, but the waves were too strong. In a moment, one canoe capsized, then another. The boys were thrown into the cold water. They tried swimming, but the waves kept pushing them under. Life jackets kept them afloat, but the water temperature was 39.2 degrees Fahrenheit. An average adult won't last beyond 40 minutes in it. Teachers in other canoes tried reaching the boys in the water, but the storm was too violent. Their own canoes were taking on water. Some started capsizing too. The storm lasted for hours. By the time it passed, rescue boats found survivors clinging to overturned canoes, shivering violently in shock. Others floated face down in life jackets. Their bodies had given up fighting the cold. 13 people died, 12 boys and 1 teacher. They drowned and died from hypothermia on a school trip that was supposed to build character. The lake took them one by one while their classmates watched helplessly. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.